In this session, we're going to look at the assumptions upon which your program planning is based. Everything we do in life has assumptions. It requires assumptions to live freely. For example, when I go to get in my car to drive, I am assuming that when my wife came home, she didn't bring it home empty. I assume that there's petrol in the car. It's an assumption. We need assumptions to live well. And program plans are full of assumptions. So it's really important to unpack what they are and to find out whether those assumptions are fair and reasonable. Program planning has to be based on fair and reasonable assumptions. So in order to do that, I love a big blank sheet of paper. You should be able to fill the paper with your assumptions. And I use a few categories to get my mind around why I planned the way I do and what I'm assuming will happen. So my first category for assumptions is, what are you assuming about yourself, your team, and your organisation? Now that's pretty big. What are you assuming about yourself, your team, and organisation? For example, in that, are you assuming that your team will be together for a period of 2 years without any interruption? Is that an assumption you have made? Are you assuming that the organisation that you're working with will stay strong and be able to support you? These are assumptions. So write down the assumptions that you have about yourself, your family, your team, and your organisation. And when you write them down, assess whether they're fair and reasonable assumptions. Another category is relationships. I put this one up high because projects are basically run on good relationships. When relationships are healthy, it allows you to think creatively, come up with new solutions. So the quality of the relationships that you work in are really important. So what are you assuming about the quality of the relationships? Are you assuming that they will remain strong, or are you assuming that they will improve from where they are? Are you assuming that more people will be added to it and they will easily fit within the team? What are your assumptions about the relationships? Number 3 is, what are your assumptions about the availability of infrastructure and resources? So you've written out your program plan, your logical program plan. What have you assumed about funding? What have you assumed about when it will be available and how much would be available? What have you assumed about the people, when they will be available or if they will be available? What have you assumed about infrastructure? Have you assumed that for example, if you're a literacy project and you want to run it in a classroom setting, have you assumed that there will be available a suitable classroom within the community? What are your assumptions about infrastructure? Write them down and ask the question, are they fair and reasonable? And can I base my program on that assumption being true? A fourth area is, what are you assuming about the capacity of the local community? Have you been realistic? Or have you undersold the local community? May they be able to do more than you have assumed? Because it's as big a mistake to assume too little as it is to assume too much. So what are you assuming about the capacity of the local community in your program plan? Write down the key assumptions you make and ask the question, are they fair and reasonable? And if they are, the program plan is a fair and reasonable plan. And the final area that I use in my mind, this is a really important one, I call it life cycles. What are the life cycles that you're dealing with? So in a life cycle can be the weather. I worked in the Northern Territory where we had a dry and wet season. And in the wet season, it's very humid. And the idea of running a workshop in the wet season, for example, was highly problematic. One, because the rivers could be up and you can't travel. It's so hot and humid, no one feels like working. So there's a life cycle around the weather. So in my program planning, what have I assumed? Have I assumed that the dry season has started by this time? Have I assumed that the wet season started late or was in? What have I assumed around life cycle? Also in life cycle, we've got what have I assumed about the community? For example, if it's a farming community, there's a time in the season when you plant and there's a time in the season when you reap. Generally during planting time and reaping time, there's no time for anything else in the community. So there's a life cycle. So how well does my program plan fit within the life cycle of the community? So what are the assumptions I've made there? They're fairly important. And other assumptions you make are generally around celebration and ritual that occur in communities. Have I assumed certain things? Now, I come from Victoria in Australia, and there's the biggest ceremony you'd call or ritual in Australia is the football grand final in the last week of September every year. And some people forget that at times, and they organise something on that day, and they'll find half the people don't turn up because they're home watching the football or they're going to the football. So the outsider might miss that, but the insider knows that the last week in September is sacred in Melbourne. So what are the rituals in the community? And what are your own rituals? Life cycle. What's your family's life cycle about holidays and school holidays? And if you're from outside the country, your furloughs when you go back to your own country and visit. All that has to be in your program planning, and you have to look at the assumptions there and do they line up? Are they fair and reasonable? Now, I've been doing this for a number of years, and I've been surprised at the assumptions people make. For example, I was talking to a translation team once, many years ago, where the habit was for the translation team to think of themselves in the community for 20, 25 years. And they're making a long-term program plan. And I commented to them, well, you're assuming you're going to be there for that 20, 25 years. I think you should assume only about 7 years in the community. And they were shocked by this. How come? I said, because I've assessed all the data of all the language projects for the last 20 years and found that the average time in the community is 7 years, even though you're planning 20. So if it was 7 years, how would it change? So, assumption that we have a long-term commitment to this project and we can fulfill that. Is that assumption correct? So you've got to look at life cycles. One last comment about assumptions is the key part is actually identifying them, because assumptions are normally hidden. So this process is important for clarity in your thinking and just going a little deeper. Also, when you discuss these assumptions with your team and your partners, it's actually a wonderful team building exercise, because you bring to the surface what is hidden. And in having that conversation, you get a much higher level of clarity about each other and understanding of each other. So this exercise, I think, is vital for your program planning. Another thing that you can add into your program planning assessment, if you like, is to identify the challenges. The challenges are more concrete, probably much more clearer to you, but you can sit down and identify 5 clear challenges that you face. With those challenges, there's 2 options. One is that you remove the obstacle, you remove the challenge by things that you do. But the other is that the challenge will always be there, and you learn how to work around that challenge rather than remove the challenge. So identify 5 or 6 key challenges in your project. Decide how you'll approach those challenges. What's God asking you to do in that situation? Of course, as Christians, it's a great opportunity to bring them to the Lord, and He is very capable of doing some amazing things with those challenges as He leads you by the Spirit. So identify your challenges. There's a third area that's useful to bring to the surface, and technically in program planning they call them enablers. I don't really like that word enablers, but I'd prefer phrases like the wind in my sails or the wind in my back. What are the things that are supporting the initiative? Who's the cheer squad behind this? Who are my fellow travellers, who have a heart and a passion for what we're doing, or otherwise called enablers. So it is helpful to know who is on your team and those who are outside your team who share your passion or share one aspect of your passion and can be helpful in moving the project forward in a more robust way. So they're enablers. It's worth taking the time to identify them. I remember years ago doing project planning in the Aboriginal Creole project, and under this heading, we didn't have the word enablers, but under the heading of supporters, we noticed that the Anglican Church and the Bishop of the Northern Territory was very supportive of local languages. And so we moved the Bishop's name to the top and gone, he is a really important partner here. We need to get to know his passion and have him on board, which is what happened, and he became a driving force for the translation project. So it's good to take the time to recognise who those people are and work out how to work with them and them to work with you. So they're enablers. So get your blank piece of paper, start writing these ideas down, and do it together, and do it as a team building exercise, and also an exercise in strengthening the program plan that you've already written and getting greater clarity and confidence in the plan that you're putting forward.